In 1918, incidents were recorded across New Orleans involving forced entry and violence inside private homes. The events were not isolated. Victims were found inside their residences, often attacked while they slept. In most cases, the entry point had already existed. In 1918, New Orleans was an active, populated city built on routine. Residential neighborhoods were closely spaced. Homes were occupied, lived in, and part of a daily pattern that extended beyond the street. Work, family, and community all moving through predictable cycles. People returned home at the end of the day. Doors were locked. Windows were closed or left partially open in response to the heat. What happened inside those homes was private and expected to remain that way. The city itself was not unfamiliar with crime. Incidents occurred as they did in any urban environment, but they were typically understood as isolated, limited to specific locations or circumstances. What began in 1918 did not follow that expectation. The events occurred in different parts of the city, different households, different individuals. There was no immediate connection between them that could be seen from the outside. But the pattern was not in who was targeted. It was in how the entry was made. In many of the cases, there was no clear sign of forced entry in the conventional sense. Doors were not always broken. Windows were not always shattered. The access point already existed. A panel removed, a section opened, something that allowed entry without immediate detection. The attacks happened at night, inside spaces that were assumed to be secure. Victims were often found in their own bedrooms. The location itself became part of what made the events different. This was not something happening in public. It was not visible until after it had already occurred, and once the pattern began to form, the understanding of safety inside the home began to change. Locks remained, doors remained, but the assumption behind them that they were enough began to weaken. The early reports did not arrive all at once. They appeared as separate incidents, different addresses, different households. At first, nothing required them to be connected. If you were standing outside one of these homes the next morning, there would be no immediate sign of what had happened inside. The street would remain unchanged, people moving as they normally would, doors closed, windows in place, nothing outwardly disrupted. The difference was contained within the structure itself. Inside, the space showed signs of disturbance, but not the kind that spread outward. Furniture slightly displaced, objects out of position, indications that movement had occurred where it should not have. In some cases, entry points could be identified only after inspection. A panel removed from a door, a section loosened, something that had been part of the structure altered just enough to allow access. From the outside, it remained largely intact. The entry did not announce itself. It existed quietly within the construction of the home. The timing was consistent. Night, when the occupants were inside, when the expectation was that nothing external would cross into that space. The reports began to show similarities, not in the people involved, but in the way the events unfolded. Entry without immediate detection, movement within the home. The event contained within the structure, and by the time it was recognized, it had already ended. As more incidents were reported, the pattern became harder to ignore. What had been separate events began to be compared. Details were repeated, methods aligned. The structure of the events remained consistent, even as the locations changed. If you were inside one of these homes after the fact, the space would feel intact at a distance. Walls standing, doors in place, nothing visibly broken in a way that explained what had occurred. But closer inspection would show the same small points of access. A section removed, a panel displaced, something that allowed entry without force in the conventional sense. It wasn't the kind of damage that drew attention from the street. It required someone to be inside the space to see it. As awareness increased, the response shifted. People began checking their homes more closely. Doors, windows, structural details that had previously gone unnoticed. The assumption of security began to change. Not because everything had been broken, but because something had been able to pass through without being seen. The events remained contained within private spaces. They did not move into public view. They did not leave visible traces that could be followed from one location to another. Each incident ended where it occurred. There was no clear continuation from one house to the next, only repetition. And with repetition came recognition that what was happening was not random. It followed a method. It respected the boundary of the home just enough to pass through it. And once inside, it did not leave a path behind. As the pattern became recognized, it began to be described as a single series. The incidents were no longer treated as isolated. They were grouped, compared, tracked. At that point, a name began to appear in reports and discussion, not as an identified person, but as a way to refer to what was happening. The Axeman. The name did not come from a confirmed identity. It came from the method that had been observed. It gave shape to something that had not yet been defined, but naming it did not resolve it. If you were standing outside one of the houses after one of these events, the structure would remain in place. The exterior unchanged, neighbors nearby, the street continuing as it always had. There would be no visible indication of who had entered or how they had moved from one location to another. The events did not create a trail that could be followed from one house to the next. They remained contained, each one ending where it occurred. At one point, a letter was published in a local newspaper. It claimed to be written by the person responsible. The letter did not provide a name. It did not confirm an identity that could be verified. It described intention. It referenced future action. And it introduced a detail that was widely reported afterward. That on a specific night, those who played music would not be harmed. The response was observable. Music was played across the city. Homes, clubs, and public spaces filled with sound. Whether the letter was genuine or not was never confirmed. But it influenced behavior. It became part of the pattern, not of the attacks, but of the reaction to them. Investigations continued. Suspects were considered. Individuals were questioned. But no single person was identified in a way that resolved the series. There were theories. Some suggested a single individual moving between locations. Others considered the possibility of unrelated incidents being grouped together due to similarities in method. There were also suggestions tied to personal disputes or local conflicts where specific events may have had explanations that did not extend to the entire pattern. None of these explanations accounted for everything. No single theory aligned with all known details, and none resulted in a confirmed conclusion. Over time, the incidents stopped. Not through resolution, not through identification, but through absence. The pattern ended. The name remained. What is left is not a complete account. It is a series of entries that align in method, occur within the same period, and fail to connect to a confirmed source. If you return to those streets, the structures are still there. The doors, the windows, the same points of entry that once existed as part of their construction. Nothing marks them as different from any other home. Nothing indicates that they were once part of a pattern that could not be fully explained. The events remain recorded. The name remains attached to them. But the identity behind it does not, and the system that was expected to identify and resolve it did not produce an answer. That was tonight's story. You've been listening to The Midnight Box. Wherever you are, thank you for listening. Good night.